Okay, welcome to this week's lecture on the first half of Macbeth. Okay, or subtitle here, Witches, Magic, and Fate. Okay, so for a quick note on the textual history of this play, Macbeth is one of those plays where we only have one early edition of it that comes from the 1624 folio. So we don't have any quarto versions of this play. We don't have any versions of this play that were published in Shakespeare's lifetime. This is the only version that we have. What we know about it is that the version in the folio is quite a bit shorter than most of Shakespeare's other tragedies, which leads some scholars to believe that this version in the folio is actually a shortened or cut version that was used for a specific performance, and that once upon a time there may have been a much longer version of this play circulating or performed or out there somewhere. Um, and that idea is really tantalizing and frustrating to Shakespearean scholars, that there might be more Macbeth that exists or existed in time, and we don't have access to it because all we have is this cut and shortened version of Macbeth. The other thing that we know about this play is that it was most likely had a co-writer. And I know sometimes a lot of people are surprised to learn that not all of Shakespeare's plays were 100% written by Shakespeare, but it was actually extremely common in Shakespeare's days for plays to be co-written or to be changed and added by other authors working for the company, because there were just so many plays that these theatrical companies needed to pump out every year. And so playwrights would work together, they'd bounce ideas off each other, and they would help each other write scenes all the time. Um, Shakespeare was actually probably more of a lone wolf than some of the other playwrights, but it's very common for co-writing. So we definitely know that some portions of this play were written by Sir Thomas Middleton, who was another rather famous playwright in Shakespeare's day. Um, I'm not sure if we've gotten to any of those scenes yet. Most of them um, were songs or things that are attributed to the witches that we are pretty sure Sir Thomas Middleton wrote. But there may have been more sections of this play that were written by others. Okay, so let's talk about Shakespeare's sources. Okay, so Macbeth is actually a real historical figure, a real historical Scottish king. Um, Shakespeare drew his story from this history book called um, the Holinshed Chronicles, and the Holinshed Chronicles contained a lot of British history, the history of all the kings. The problem with them was that they weren't extremely accurate. They contained a lot of hearsay stories and a lot of legend type stories, and Macbeth falls in that category. So Holinshed's Chronicles does not have a very accurate version of Macbeth in it. So Shakespeare's version of Macbeth is not very historically accurate at all. So what we know about the real historical Macbeth, it's actually not a whole lot, but we do know. See here, I have a little bit of a genealogy of these Scottish kings, or they were called the Kings of Alba, because it was a smaller area than modern day Scotland. Part of Scotland was ruled by some invading Scandinavians at the time. But anyway, there was a real King Duncan who ruled from about 1034 to 1040, and he was killed in battle by Macbeth. So it was not some clandestine murder in Macbeth's house or anything like that. He was legitimately killed in battle. I am not sure what the battle was about or what it was over, but because he was killed by Macbeth in battle, Macbeth then laid claim to the title of king, and he seems to have been accepted as king without too much controversy. I mean, There was always a little bit of controversy, but that's a perennial problem with kings. And Macbeth actually had a relatively peaceful reign for about 17 years, so a fairly long time, and a fairly peaceful reign. Um, Macbeth was succeeded by his stepson Lulach. Um, so Macbeth did not have any, doesn't appear to have had any legitimate children of his own, but his wife had a son from a previous marriage named Lulach, who was Macbeth's heir and became king after him. After Lulach, the kingdom reverted to Malcolm III, who is actually Duncan's son. So this part's interesting. When Duncan was killed in battle, he had two sons, um, Malcolm and Donalbain, and both of them were very young. They were very young boys, which I believe is also true in the play. And anyway, the sons were taken away out of Scotland for protection during Macbeth's reign, and so Malcolm grew up in England. Um, and when he came of age, amassed an army or whatever, came back and fought. And Malcolm III is actually who killed Macbeth in battle. And then they crowned Lulach, Macbeth's supporters crowned Lulach as king, but it was only a few months later that Malcolm III killed Lulach as well, and then was crowned in their place. So the reign of the kings mostly stayed in the Duncan Malcolm family line, with this little bit of a detour to Macbeth and Lulach. Malcolm III was, by all accounts, a beloved king, considered a great ruler, and he had a nice long reign from 1058 to 1093. So, an important thing to note about this timeline is that Banquo is not a real historical figure. However, according to Holinshed's Chronicles and what was believed in Shakespeare's time, people actually thought that Banquo was a real historical figure. And they really believed that King James descended through Banquo's descendants. So I'm not sure how that whole tree or family line worked, or how they thought it worked back then, but they did believe in Shakespeare's day that King James descended from Banquo's descendants. Thus, the witch's prophecy that Macbeth would become king and Banquo's sons would become kings after him. But no, there is actually no historical evidence of anyone named Banquo, and in fact, it does appear that the modern British monarchy does descend or has some sort of ancestry related to this Malcolm Duncan line. Malcolm III is probably the actual ancestor of the modern kings. So that's some of the real historical background there. This play was written, or it's considered to have been written, in homage to King James, who took over, who became the monarch after Queen Elizabeth passed away, and shortly after he became monarch, he named Shakespeare's company as the King's Men. So King James was Shakespeare's company's patron. So many people believe that Shakespeare wrote this play in homage to King James and his Scottish ancestry. Now, it's not necessarily a play praising King James' Scottish ancestors. Macbeth wasn't actually his ancestor, right? They believe Banquo was. But I'm sure what we understand is that the Scottish play was still meant to be of interest to King James, right? He was very interested in Scotland, had lots of connections there. And that also is our explanation for the addition of the witches in this story. So in the original historical version, all original historical versions, even Holinshed's Chronicles, there's no mention of witches ever as being part of Macbeth's story. That doesn't come from the histories. That is Shakespeare's own edition, but it was also Shakespeare's edition um, as something that was interesting to King James and interesting to current events going on in England, or that had been going on in England for the past decade and a half or so. Your introduction talked about um, the gunpowder plot being some of the historical context that influenced the story of this play, but it didn't mention what was another huge historical influence on this play, the North Benwick witch trials, um, which had been happening in Scotland. And these witch trials were a really big national deal. They were sort of England's Salem witch trials. Um, and these were ongoing throughout the 1590s, and there were uh, several hundred, I believe it was in the hundreds, women and men who were accused of being witches or of practicing witchcraft. Now, King James was super interested in these trials because some of the witches claimed, there was a group of 3 or 4 witches who had claimed to have cursed a ship that his wife, Queen Anne, or she was Princess Anne at the time, had sailed on. And during that voyage, during that trip, another ship in the fleet, not Queen Anne's, but another ship in the fleet, did actually sink due to some bad weather. So there's the conversation that the witches have in the play, in that opening scene where we see the witches, where they're talking about conjuring up winds and bad weather for ships, to bring ships down, and that's some real life current events drawn directly from these North Benwick witch trials. So King James gets super interested in these witch trials and in the idea of witchcraft. And some of the witches were brought before Prince. He was prince at the time. He wasn't the king yet in the 1590s, but some of the witches were brought before him to testify or to give their confessions. Um, and oh, it was these stories are kind of tragic if you read them, because most of these witches don't confess until they've been put through horrendous torture, right? Which we know from modern psychology is probably why they confessed to witchcraft, is because the torture was just so awful. There was torture, there was burnings at the stake, there was just lots of horrible stuff. And let's see, I think the statistic I read was that between from like the beginning of the 1500s through about 1700, there were probably 3 to 4,000 women and men killed in England because they were accused of being witches. So this is a really interesting historical topic at the time. Now, like I said, James actually was so interested in this topic of witchcraft. He gets so interested. Oh, sorry, this is a picture. This is a picture of the North Berwick witch trials. You can see some hanging witches there. Ugh. So anyway, and this was in the news. There were lots of pamphlets going around describing these witch trials. It was very much in the public consciousness at the time. So James gets so interested in this topic of witchcraft that he actually wrote a book. He's one of the few English monarchs. I mean, they wrote all sorts of things, but to actually write a full book, you can see, written by the high and mighty Prince James, on demonology. So that's what this book is called, Demonology, in the form of a dialogue, meaning he has characters speaking about witchcraft. So he writes this entire book, and what all this book is about is trying to convince people that witchcraft is real, that it's mentioned in the Bible, that it actually exists, and it categorizes all the different types of witchcraft, or dark magic, goes through and categorizes it all. And then published with this book, Demonology, was also one of the pamphlets about one of the more famous trials from the North Berwick witch trials, detailing some of the um, curses or some of the practices that some of these witches confessed to um, after being tortured. I should note. Um, so uh, that history is all sort of tragic, especially from our modern perspective on what witchcraft is. Um, but at the time, this was a very serious topic, and very very much in the public realm, being debated and wondered about and worried about. Um, and so James's deep interest in witchcraft is one of the most likely reasons that Shakespeare decided to include witches in the play of Macbeth. And it's a very interesting choice that has some very interesting consequences for us thinking about um, Macbeth's actions and Macbeth's choices. Um, so we'll talk about some of that in just a second. But first, just a little fun fact. Don't know if you've ever heard of Macbeth being called the cursed play. Um, there's this great tradition in theater that when Macbeth is being performed or produced or performed by a theater company, they will not name the play inside the theater house. They will call it the Scottish play or the cursed play, but they do not refer to it by the name of Macbeth, even though when you're putting on the play, you have to say Macbeth's name a million times. Um, and there's this really silly tradition that if someone mentions the name of Macbeth to break the curse of the play, they have to exit the theater, they have to turn around 3 times, they have to spit, they have to curse. There might be a couple other steps in that ritual, and then they have to knock on the door to be allowed back into the theater to break the curse. Um, so the sort of the history behind why theater people seem to think this play is cursed. They say it's been cursed from the beginning, because actual witches in Shakespeare's day were displeased that Shakespeare included actual spells in the um, in the script of the play, and so they cursed the play. And so the legend has it that there were all sorts of problems with the first production of this play, all sorts of mishaps and accidents and things like that, and that tradition has continued. That all of these famous productions of Macbeth have all had very serious accidents or problems that have sort of fed into this mythos of the play being cursed. I think the most famous one I've heard of is that Laurence Olivier, on a production of Macbeth, was nearly killed by a falling, I can't remember what it was, a falling light or a falling stage prop or something. Um, and so all of that has just sort of fed into this mythology that Macbeth is the cursed play. So if you're ever in a theater house and you want to make your theater friends happy, you call it the Scottish play. Don't say the name of the play out loud. Anyway, but back to the role that the witches actually play in the play. It's in the play itself. The role that the witches play in the play itself. Um, so what is unclear is honestly how we're supposed to view the witches, and whether we're supposed to view them as actual beings of power, who have power or who have power to bring things about, whether they're more like the three fates, just predicting fate, whether they cause this story to happen or whether they just foretell it's happening. And this is a very interesting question to consider. So in that first act, right, the whole thing that sets this whole play in motion, they meet Macbeth and Banquo on the battlefield, and they hail him as first Thane of Glamis, which is what his title, his current title when he meets them. Then they hail him as Thane of Cawdor, which is a title he doesn't expect to be greeted by, and then they hail him as king, um, basically predicting that he is going to become the king. Well, we see in the next scene the king's envoy comes up, the messengers come up, and they also hail Macbeth as Thane of Cawdor. He's been granted this title by the king in a move of fate that Macbeth did not see coming. Um, and and all of a sudden that switches a gear in Macbeth's head, that he is now um, anticipating that because this one prophecy came true, that these witches told him that he'd become Thane of Cawdor, um, now he anticipates this next prophecy coming true, which is that he will be the next king, even though there's no clear line for him to succeed the king. Um, so the question becomes, if it's fate, if what these witches have said is true, is going to be true, does Macbeth actually have to do anything to become the king? He didn't have to do anything to become the Thane of Cawdor. That just happened. That just fell into his plate. And and so shouldn't he be able to assume that he doesn't have to do anything to become the king? Well, that's sort of the question about the role of fate or these supernatural forces versus free will. Um, and the free will is that Macbeth, and certainly Lady Macbeth, seems to think that they need to act to make Macbeth king. They need to take the matter into their own hands. They need to murder the king, and they need to um, set Macbeth up to be the next king, which is what they do. But that leads them down, a super dark path. And and so the question still lingers. Did they have to act at all? Right? This is sort of the question that we consider in Julius Caesar too, right? What is the role of fate versus human action? Or were the witches just able to foretell that having told him he would be king, it would spark his ambition enough to make him act to become king? It might be a little bit of a chicken and egg question, but it is an interesting question to mull over, right? Um, did the witches foretell what was already going to happen, or did they cause what was going to happen by foretelling it? Are they actually magical and powerful, and in divining the future, or are they just making the future happen through their words? Um, Okay, so these questions to be thinking about, especially as we continue on through the play. What is the role of fate or these supernatural forces versus free will in Macbeth's actions? And also on that same line, what about fate versus ambition, right? That's especially what moves Lady Macbeth um, to action, is that this prophecy spurs their ambition, right? So fate versus ambition. Another interesting question to consider. What is going on with gender roles in this play? Um, this is a super interesting play to think about feminism or to think about the portrayal of women. So a couple of things to point out. I don't know if you noticed, but in that first scene, Banquo describes the witches as having beards. And so much has been made of this. What does that mean that the witches had beards? Does this mean that the witches are unnatural women, or that they are powerful women and therefore more like males? Or maybe what I'm leaning towards is, if you remember, all female roles were acted by men on Shakespeare's stage anyway, so it's possible these these witch roles were just being performed by male actors who had beards, and so it was just sort of an inside joke. That's one possibility. Um, but then we also have to talk about Lady Macbeth, right? And she has that really famous speech, her first speech right after she reads her husband's letter about unsex me now, um, give me the strength of a man, essentially to bring this about. She is a super interesting character. So we're going to talk some more about her and what happens to her next week. What's going on with Lady Macbeth? She is one of Shakespeare's most interesting female characters, for sure. Um, so think about what's going on with gender roles. Let's think about, especially as we move into these next acts, what is the psychology of guilt being portrayed here? What is evil and what is good, right? Let's think about that. And then finally, What's the role of language? You know that I love thinking about how language is working in these plays as a force to bring things about. So, especially in relation to magic and fate, right? Um, the words that the witches speak, particularly. What's the role of language in bringing about the actions of the play? Um, the speaking of spells, right? Spells. Think that spell is we spell words and we spell magic. Um, so what's the role of language? And we're gonna have a very interesting discussion about this, especially when we get to the high point of action, the very last scene when there's a tricky, fun play on words or pun on words that really the whole plot of the play hinges around. So we'll talk about all of these things next week as we finish up Macbeth.